The city that is now called New York was founded by the Dutch, and they called it New Amsterdam. So let me tell you the story of how the Dutch ended up there and why they lost this city. This whole story began with Henry Hudson's desire to open the Northern Strait from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Finding the first investments to finance such an expedition was quite easy, because the British, who had just founded East India Company, really did not want to waste resources on the war with the Portuguese and Spaniards, who at that time controlled the route to India from the African side. Plus, the northern route was considered shorter. But to the great disappointment of investors and Hudson himself, the expedition failed due to ice barriers and difficult climatic conditions. And British investors no longer wanted to spend money on these adventures. At the same time, Hudson himself did not give up. Instead, he found other investors in the form of Dutch merchants who were also interested in a new route to India. And when the expedition failed again, Hudson was so reluctant to return home empty-handed that he decided to bring something back. Therefore, on the way back, he decided to check out another rumor about a river in the north. By the way, the river itself would later be named in his honor, the Hudson River. Well, although the rumors themselves were also not justified, the Dutch themselves were not happy with such a discovery. Nevertheless, the Dutch were interested in the opportunities for trade in that area. And according to Hudson's reports, the banks of this river were very rich in valuable fur animals, especially beavers, the skin of which was highly valued in European countries. Therefore, on the basis of this discovery, which they considered their own, they decided to create the Dutch West India Company, which received a monopoly on the colonization of the American coast. The beginning of this colonization was to be the area near the Hudson River. And in 1624, the Dutch on the island of Manhattan decided to build a fort, which they called Amsterdam. A small settlement called New Amsterdam was also built near the fort. In general, the Dutch considered the settlement itself exclusively as a commercial project. That is, it was a kind of trading post which was supposed to establish trade with the local population. It was mainly about beaver skins. Moreover, all the activities of this representative office were strictly regulated by the company's rules. For example, the company set strict limits on the size of the settlement itself. Each resident of this settlement had to work in the interests of the company and perform certain functional duties. The company also categorically opposed the construction of a school, church, and other social institutions, believing that these expenses would significantly reduce the company's profits. And therefore, it is not at all surprising that the settlement itself was more like a pirate Tortuga than a civilized city, because all the leisure activities of this settlement consisted of only a few pubs and small shops. However, later the company leaders still had to reconsider their views on the development of this colony. They were based on the fact that there were also British colonial settlements nearby, which were developing quite rapidly. And if this trend continued, the British would soon capture the Dutch settlement, which simply would not have anyone to protect. Therefore, the company's management was forced to relax restrictions on the number of new settlers, but at the same time maintain tight control over their civil liberties. And on the one hand, the newly arrived settlers were no longer considered hired personnel of the company and had more freedom. And on the other, they were still required to recognize the sovereignty of the Dutch West India Company and pay annual taxes to this company, which were supposed to go to the improvement of this settlement. Although this paradigm shift led to New Amsterdam becoming a thriving Dutch town within 2 decades, complete with a stone church, large stone houses, an expanded fort, a governor's residence, and a school, there was a downside. The settlement was still viewed by the company as a commercial venture, with the goal of generating profits for its shareholders. The governors of New Netherland therefore did everything they could to stifle the emergence of civil society. This situation of confrontation between the community and the authorities was especially evident when Peter Stuyvesant was appointed governor. In fact, Stuyvesant cannot be called a very bad leader. For example, he passed laws prohibiting the sale of alcohol on Sundays and punished fights with fines. He also issued a decree to destroy the old dirty areas and create official streets, which were to be paved with stone. People also began to be fined for throwing garbage on the streets, because a landfill was created for this. And although all this caused discontent thanks to these reforms, the settlement changed its appearance for the better. Nevertheless, such an authoritarian style of management also had its drawbacks, because the only legal system that worked there was based on the own beliefs of the governor and the owners. Some could be punished, while others could escape punishment for the same actions because they had connections with the leadership. Moreover, since the company's rules were considered law, Any challenge to these rules was considered an act of disobedience and an attempt to undermine the company's authority. And such an act was regarded as the equivalent of treason with the maximum penalty. For example, when Adriaen van der Donck arrived in the colony, at first he somehow tried to fight the company to create a civil society. And when he saw that there was no point in fighting, he began to write letters to the Netherlands, so that the territory of the colony was taken from the company and given under the jurisdiction of the Dutch government. And for this act of disobedience, Stuyvesant accused him of treason and established the maximum penalty, the death penalty. Van der Donck was saved only by the fact that he was a fairly well-known person in the community, and a lot of people came to his defense. In general, the whole problem was that the company's leaders considered the colony and its inhabitants as their property. At the same time, the colonists themselves, who came from the old world in search of a new life, did not expect to fall under the military dictatorship of a private company. And such an authoritarian style of management, which was reduced to the manic protection of the interests of the company's investors, led to the fact that the population of New Amsterdam itself did not feel any loyalty either to the company itself or to its leadership. And it was this lack of loyalty that caused the loss of the city. It all started when King Charles II of England gifted his brother James, Duke of York, lands in eastern North America, including the area near the Hudson River. And in 1665, 2 military frigates under the flag of the British Crown arrived in Manhattan and issued an ultimatum to the governor to surrender the city without a fight. And to push the authorities to surrender the city, they promised the residents everything that the Dutch did not want to give them. And in return, they asked the people to put pressure on the governor to surrender the settlement without a fight. And soon, under the calls of the crowd, Stuyvesant was forced to surrender the settlement, and the British immediately after the capture renamed it New York, in honor of the Duke of York, who captured it.